What is up, everybody? So I've had this idea for quite a while to start a wrestling-related podcast and talk about both maritime wrestling and everything else. I just basically never did it, but I've been talking to a few people about this lately. We have a couple of ideas we're going to implement as it goes forward. But I've wanted to do this for quite some time. I've wanted a place where I could talk about maritime wrestling plus WWE, AEW, TNA, whatever else there is going on in the wrestling world. I just love talking about wrestling. I've been a wrestling fan my entire life. And I've gathered a fair, it's not giant by any stretch of the imagination, but I have gathered a fairly good following for someone like me across all social media platforms. I'm at just about 300,000 followers. It's just under 300,000 followers right now, but hopefully it keeps growing. I can't even begin to explain how much I appreciate each and every one of you, but we're going to talk a little bit about some maritime wrestling. I'm going to explain, I get this question a lot at local shows and messages everywhere, how I got involved in the maritime wrestling scene. And I'm going to go through some of my experiences along the way as well. Plus, we'll talk about some WWE, the debut on Netflix, talk about SmackDown, NXT as well in this episode. So, I got involved in maritime wrestling way back in 2001. I had a job back in the spring of 2001. I was on break, and when I came back downstairs, someone had stuck this big, it wasn't even one of the small posters, it was one of like the big ones, stuck it to the board next to the customer service desk where I worked. I had a look at it and I was like, holy crap, this is wrestling. There's wrestling here. See, growing up, I had no idea what independent wrestling was. I didn't know it existed. I knew what Grand Prix wrestling was, but it didn't really click in or clue in that there was like indie wrestling in my area. I don't know why nobody took me to it as a child because I was everything WWE when I was growing up. But anyway, I looked at it and it was a poster for a Grand Prix wrestling show that was happening later that night at the Halifax Forum Multi-Purpose Center. This would have been in I don't remember, April or May of 2001. So I am absolutely going to this. I had never heard of anybody that was on the show before. I had heard of, because of Grand Prix Wrestling, I had heard of Emile Dupree, the guy that ran it. I knew who the Beast was and Bobby K, Rudy K, Leo Burke, all of them. I knew their names, but I didn't know, it didn't click. I just didn't know what they were actually a part of. None of them were on the poster, but someone named Rene Dupree was on the poster. He was 16 years old, I believe, at the time, and he was gigantic. So anyway, I went home after work, grabbed my replica WWF, the round one, it's right there, that Triple H wore. I have 3 replica belts, but I grabbed that one and I headed to the venue because I wanted to have the best seats in the house for this show. There's wrestling. There's going to be 1,000 people there, right? So I get there probably 2 hours before the doors open. I'm the only one in line, but again, I'm like, oh, whatever. People are just like, it's a work day. People are getting here late. The line is going to be gigantic anytime now. So the line never really happens. But at one point in time, someone comes out and was like, we heard there was somebody out here with a replica belt. I was wondering if I could take it out back and show the boys. Knowing what I know now about local wrestling, God only knows what happened to that belt while it was away from me for the 10 or 15 minutes. But that person turned out to be Mike Zink. Mike Zink was co-promoting with Emile Dupree that spring and summer for Grand Prix Wrestling. And he would become a very important part in my journey. So Mike Zink comes out, takes the belt, brings it out back, and then eventually brings it back to me. So the doors open, I rush in, I'm front row center. There's about 13 people in the crowd that night. I could care less. I'm front row center. I'm losing it. one of the wrestlers, he was in the opening match, comes out and grabs the belt from me and holds it up. And that wrestler was Flesh Gordon, if you know who that is. He's kind of looked a little bit like Scott Steiner, not as big, still gigantic, but not as big as Scott Steiner. Had the same like blonde haircut, big fella, super nice. I would later like spend a little bit of time with him, chat with him. I actually got to catch up with him a year or so ago online. He opened up Facebook and I reached out and we started talking about the old Grand Prix and real action wrestling days. So the show happened. I had no idea what to expect, but I definitely wasn't disappointed. It was, those guys put on an incredible show. That was my first independent wrestling show. So after the show, somebody comes out and was like, I saw this belt here, and I was just wondering if I could take a look at it. They had it backstage earlier, but I didn't get a chance to see it. I'm like, absolutely. So I give him the belt, whatever. We start talking, and he was like, there's another show coming up. I can't remember when it was, sometime later that spring, early that summer, in Bridgewater. It's not a Grand Prix wrestling show, but it's another company. That person was Scott Savage, who I would later, thanks to Lincoln Steen, be named after. That's where the new Scott comes from Scott Savage. He got into the wrestling business the same way I did, driving the boys around, setting up the ring, stacking chairs, just doing absolutely anything and everything that was needed. Showing up and just doing everything and anything. And trust me when I tell you, I did anything and everything that was asked of me back then. So there was a couple of more Grand Prix shows at the Forum. I think they ran weekly or every 2 weeks during those couple of months. One note, during the main event of one of the shows, the match was Mad Dog McFly taking on Rene Dupree. A fan, and I have this on tape somewhere. I wasn't filming shows yet, but there was someone there with a video camera. I have this clip somewhere. A fan jumped the rail and took a swing at Mad Dog. He missed. It was a smaller guy, and then Mad Dog just opened up on this guy. His face exploded. It looked like a one-sided hockey fight. Mad Dog McFly was giant. He was a big man, and he'd 5 or 6 punches right to this guy's face on the apron. He goes down. His nose and face exploded. And then they finished the match. It was a good time. So that was my first experience with something like that as well. But then later, I go to this show. Oh, wait, let me back up 1 second. So after that, a couple of those Grand Prix shows, I kept coming back, sitting in the same spot. The Mike Zinka guy comes out, and he explains to me about this other show that Scott Savage actually wrestled as JDL, Jeremiah Delinquent, back then. But he was telling me about the same show that Scott was telling me about. He was like, there's another show happening whenever it was, later that spring, later that summer. You should come down. It's in Bridgewater. It's at the Bridgewater exhibition. He's like, if you're interested, just give my name at the door. Here's my phone number. I'm like, okay, absolutely. I will 100% be there. And it turns out, and this was my first ever mainstream wrestling show. I get to the Bridgewater X. I'm like, Mike Zink said my name would be here. It wasn't, which is completely fine. And then I'm like walking around, brought my belt again. Of course, because, that's what you did. You brought your replica belts to shows. So I find where I'm just walking around and I happen to stumble upon like where everyone's getting dressed. It wasn't like a backstage area or anything. It was at an exhibition. So they just had like this room in the exhibition grounds and all the wrestlers were coming in and out. And Mike Zink sees me. He's like, we're over here. Come over. So even at this point in time, though, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to be in this locker room. So I didn't go all the way in. I just like stood in the doorway. He takes my belt from me and wallops Scott Savage in the head with it. It was a wild time. So they give the belt back to me. I talked to Scott a little bit more. I don't remember if Lincoln Steen was on this show or not. He very well could have been, but the only real people I remember from that particular show were like Scott Savage. I think Jerry Martel was there, maybe Flex Falcone. I have zero memory of it except for what got the show canceled. So there was probably, and I'm not joking, you guys are going to be like, there's no way there was that many people there. There was probably 1,500, 2,000 people there. Now, they weren't there specifically for the mainstream wrestling event. They were there just for the Bridgewater exhibition. But there was a wrestling show happening, and everybody was seated in the stands. And not a knock on anybody, but they weren't, I don't know if they weren't having the best time or what was happening. Maybe they were all drunk. I thought the show was fine. Like, I had nothing to compare it to, just those couple of Grand Prix shows. I was having a blast, but they started throwing rocks and everything you could imagine at the ring and just wouldn't stop. So they actually canceled the rest of the show for the safety of everybody involved. And so they only got a couple of matches, started throwing rocks, and then the rest of the show was canceled. Later so I went out back and I'm like, oh man, this sucks for you guys. What are you guys going to do? They're like, oh, we're just going to go home now. And for whatever reason, I don't know how we got there, probably in the ring truck, Scott Savage, JDL, didn't have a drive. So I'm like, where do you live? I'll drive you home. And he's like, I live in Dartmouth. I'm like, that's fine. I live in Halifax. It's like 10 minutes out of my way. Absolutely no problem. So driving home with Scott, just talking wrestling, WWE, or WWF at the time, just talking wrestling, realized like we both absolutely love this, right? So we started our friendship over that. I got Scott's probably ICQ at the time before everything switched over to MSN, got his ICQ, and we started chatting. Meanwhile, during all of this, so I get home from that Bridgewater show, and the next day, I open up the newspaper. I can't even tell you I used to like look through the paper all the time. I had never once seen an ad for local wrestling. After I attended my first show, I saw them everywhere. So I'm flipping through the paper, and then bam, an ad for Real Action Wrestling. Game changer. I look at this, and and this was no disrespect to anybody, but Cowboy Mike Hughes was in the ad, Brody Steele was in the ad, Bobby Roode, Joey Legend. I looked at this and I'm like, Real Action Wrestling, what is this? And I'm like, man, these guys look like the guys I watch on TV. Scott Savage, like, no disrespect, love Scott, wouldn't be here without him. Small guy, same size as me. But these guys looked gigantic. So they looked like the wrestlers you saw on television, that you saw on Raw, SmackDown. WCW wasn't a thing anymore, so that was it. So I'm like, I'm going to this show. I am super pumped. So, you know, I do what I do. I grab my replica title and I head to Exhibition Park. And I get there, and this time there was indeed a lineup. People were lined all the way to the middle way of that parking lot. Get inside. Easily 1,000 people there at this show. And I was absolutely blown away. Before I went to this show, I just started Googling like Real Action Wrestling. And I used the term Maritime Wrestling for the very first time. And nothing was coming up. And then I eventually find this website, Slam Wrestling. And the only thing I knew going into this Real Action Wrestling show was an article I found on Chi Cruz. So I go into that show only knowing anything about Chi Cruz. And I can't remember who he wrestled that night, but I left the show talking about Bobby Roode. Just from day one, you knew he had it. But during that show, during that particular Real Action Wrestling show, I was sitting there amongst all these people. Nobody, and I don't know why I thought this, nobody is filming this. These guys should have their stuff filmed. They should be able to watch this back. This is incredible. Like, why is nobody filming this? Why isn't this on TV? I didn't understand anything. So I'm like, well, I know what I'm going to do. Tomorrow, I go to Future Shop that was in Bears Lake, that was right next to the superstore that's in Bears Lake. It's been gone for more than a decade now. So I walk in and I'm like, I'm going to buy a video camera. I still have that particular camera. It's actually over there, still in the bag on the floor. So I walk in, buy a video camera. They were not cheap at that time. And then the next time Real Action Wrestling comes to town, I have absolutely no idea if I'm even allowed to be filming this. I didn't ask anybody. So I get there. I find the best seat. I go sit in the front row. I'm like, this is kind of too close to get all the angles I need. I back up and I sit there, and I didn't know this term at the time. I sat in what would be described to what everybody knows now as the hard cam. So I sat there, dead center, back up so you could see everything. I could scan the entrance, the ring, the audience, everything. So I sat there, I filmed it, got home, immediately transferred it to VHS. That's right, kids, VHS. And I watched it back probably 100 times. It was amazing. The Real Action Wrestling shows, in my opinion, were the golden era, for me anyway, of Maritime Wrestling. So I'm like, how do I get this footage to these guys? I'm like, I don't know what to, like, there's no YouTube, there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's no Instagram. There's barely an internet back in 2001, especially for local wrestling where I live. So again, I'm just like Googling on it wasn't Google then, because Google wasn't a thing. I was searching on what a search engine called Web Crawler, and I find a Real Action Wrestling message board. I'm like, what is this? So I signed up. I wasn't New Scott yet. People at where I worked called me Single H because of Triple H, and the first letter of my real name is H. So they called me Single H. I was a big Triple H fan, so that was my original nickname. I signed up, Single H, and I'm like, now what? So I'm like, I filmed this show. I don't know what to do with it. If anybody wants a copy, let me know. So, and I put my email there, which was, I don't even remember what it was. It was probably heartbreakkid@hotmail.com or something ridiculous like that. There was definitely an HBK reference in there. So I get an email from someone named Mike Hughes. And I'm like, is this like Cowboy Mike Hughes from the Real Action Wrestling show? And he's like, so I heard you have some footage of the show. I would love to see it. He's like, if you can mail me a copy to PEI. There's no internet. There's nowhere to upload video. I'm like, absolutely, what's your address? So Mike gives me his address. I make a copy of this VHS tape, and I mail it to Prince Edward Island to Cowboy Mike Hughes' house. That's how this all started. I sent a VHS tape to Cowboy Mike Hughes in PEI through the mail. Think about that. Think about how easy it is today to send footage. YouTube, Dropbox, Google Drive, whatever else there is, Facebook. I was mailing, and I did this for, good Lord, I don't know how many shows. I was mailing VHS tapes. And then after I started mailing VHS tapes to Cowboy, everyone wanted one. So I was mailing VHS tapes to people in New Brunswick, other parts of Nova Scotia. A lot of the guys lived out west. I was mailing VHS tapes there. It was a lot of money. But I was like, I don't care. Whatever it is, these guys deserve this footage. So it was an amazing time. So I started like interacting. Mike Hughes was the first guy that I ever really interacted with that was on that next level of wrestling. And honest to God, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be sitting here right now doing this video podcast, whatever it is you want to call it, about Maritime Wrestling. 24 years later, if he didn't contact me back then, maybe someone else would have, I don't know. But nobody else ever reached out like he did. So I doubt it would have ever been a thing. So if he didn't reach out and start getting me to mail him VHS tapes, I wouldn't be sitting here. I never would have been able to promote shows. I never would have been filming shows. I never would have ref shows. I never would have did basically everything there ever is to do in Maritime Wrestling except actually wrestle, which will never happen. So that's it's Mike Hughes' fault. If you want to blame somebody, it's Mike Hughes' fault. So after that show, I started going to all the Real Action Wrestling shows, and I was blown away by everything that they did. It was incredible. Wildman Gary Williams versus Bobby Roode in a ladder match is still the best independent wrestling match I've ever seen to this day, and that was back in 2001. They did a series of them. My favorite, Gary's favorite isn't my favorite. Gary's favorite is a different one. My favorite is the one they did at Exhibition Park back in September of 2001, and it's absolutely incredible. It's on my YouTube channel. Definitely check it out. So during all of this, September 2nd, 2001 comes around. There's a WWE event, WWF event at the Halifax Metro Center. I had camped out for tickets. I was front row center with my WWF world title, and whoo, baby, had a blast. But I got home, it was an afternoon show. I got home from the show that evening, and I'm like, what am I gonna do? So I'm like, I know what I'm gonna do. Not only did I think that these guys should be able to see their footage, there's nobody promoting them. Other than this one Real Action Wrestling message board that was started by Kathy Yetman, the queen of Maritime Wrestling. If there's any person there's nobody that helped me more back then with stuff on the internet than Kathy. I started calling her the queen of Maritime Wrestling, and people still call her that to this day. She was, and probably still is, she's not involved anymore, but back then, she still probably knows most of this though, she was the all-knowing everything about Maritime Wrestling. She knew everything about Grand Prix, she knew everything about Real Action Wrestling, and we became very tight, very good friends. I probably talked to Kathy more back then than anybody else on planet Earth. She lived in Cape Breton. She ran the Real Action Wrestling message board. She's how I pretty much was able to do everything on the internet. She made all my graphics back then. Lincoln Steen would later go on to make some. So September 2nd, 2001, I get home from this WWF host show, and I'm like, these guys are now seeing their footage. I'm like, what's the next step here? I'm like, there's no one advertising these guys aside from themselves. So I make a website on GeoCities. I don't call it Maritime Wrestling yet. That comes very shortly after. But I'm like, I need a name. And I'm like, Halifax Extreme Wrestling. The worst. You can still, like, if you go to, like, the Wayback Machine, that terrible website is still there. So I start figuring out how to make a website on GeoCities. I call it Halifax Extreme Wrestling. I find dates of shows through Kathy. I put them all up there. I started making wrestler profiles and pictures, and oh man, it was what Slam Wrestling was, but just for Maritime Wrestling. So I got pictures from the guys. I asked them their bio, their height, their weight, their finishers, where else they worked, titles they held, and I had bios for every single wrestler that had ever competed in the Maritimes. Now, you see a lot of people now going over results from like the early 1900s in Maritime Wrestling. All of that initially came from me. When I shut that down, other people, I guess, had saved it from my website and put it on their own website, which is totally fine. I'm glad people are still doing it, but all of those results initially came from me. Of course, I had help from other people. It wasn't just me going out there and doing all of the research, but I was the one that put them all online. I'm the reason that they're still online to this day. I'm the reason they exist. So I started doing results. I mean, it took a decade or more to get all of this stuff. It wasn't just like a one-day thing. I spent years upon years upon years that now people can spend 10 seconds trying to find, which is fine. I love that it's there. I love that. I started making profiles, finding out dates for shows. I was promoting Real Action Wrestling. I was promoting Mainstream Wrestling. There was a couple others happening at that time. 2002, it really started to grow. But Halifax Extreme Wrestling, I started advertising it. Then I started doing interviews with people. Like, I would be like, do you guys want to do an interview? How do you want to do it? Through text, via email. There was no video. I couldn't, do a split screen interview with somebody. And I still have all of those text interviews. So I would send everybody a question or a bunch of questions, and they would write them back, and I would put them all up on my website. And now people worldwide, it didn't become a giant thing until 2004, but we'll get there. But now people everywhere, all over the world, in my head, were able to read what was going on in Maritime Wrestling. And it became a very, very popular website. It was, I'm not going to get into where the New Scott thing comes from until the next video. But that's where I'm going to end this one. September 2nd, 2001, I launched the very first and only Maritime Wrestling website. Where there's never been another one, not like mine anyway. There still isn't to this day, because websites aren't. I think anybody that starts a website is just kind of a waste of time. People don't really use my website was getting hundreds of thousands of hits a day. And then Facebook, Instagram, Twitter all became a thing, and it went down to zero real quick because everybody stopped using websites. I started a Facebook page, and everybody started using that. I stopped doing the interviews at that point in time and switched over to video. Anyway, we'll get all into that. But September 2nd, 2001 is when I launched the very first Maritime Wrestling website. We got a long ways to go, people. This video right now of me recording it before editing is almost 28 minutes long. I said I was going to talk about some WWE or AEW stuff, TNA. I'll do that in a different video. But that is how I got started in Maritime Wrestling. Do you guys have any questions? I will answer anything. Anything at all. Let me know. What are your questions? What do you want to know? And the next video will pick right off from September 2nd, 2001. Thank you for watching. Hope you have an amazing day, and I will see you again soon.